This lecture focuses on positive reinforcement. So far, we've talked a lot about the three-term contingency, being the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. And if you remember, the antecedent comes directly before the behavior and is said to elicit the behavior, or to give occasion for that behavior to occur. After every behavior is a consequence. The consequence will determine whether or not the behavior will occur again in the future. Today we're going to focus on positive reinforcement, and I'm pretty sure everyone's pretty familiar with the term positive reinforcement, but probably not in the behavioral sense. So we're going to talk more about what positive reinforcement is behaviorally, and then more on Thursday I'll give you some suggestions for using positive reinforcement in your classroom. Obviously you don't have to use your whiteboards for this, but what I want you guys to do before going any further in this lecture is just kind of think about some of the pros and cons of providing rewards for correct behavior. There are definitely different points of view about whether or not rewards are a good thing, but I just want you to just think about some of the ways that you feel about offering rewards to students for displaying correct behaviors. So go ahead and pause this and just jot down a few pros and cons. So I'm going to talk to you guys about both sides. And I said before that I always want you to understand whatever side, all of the possible sides to an opinion or a point of view. And I think it'll be obvious which point of view I have, but I encourage you to find out as much as possible about both of these sides and determine where you're at. So on the side of behaviorism and research, behaviorists feel that, we know that every behavior depends on the consequences. And so often what gets thought of with behaviorists and offering rewards is that students become dependent upon these rewards because behaviorists are constantly providing rewards for every little thing. And how behaviorists would respond to that is that if you're using applied behavior analysis well, you understand that maybe at first when you're learning a new skill, you want to constantly be giving praise or edibles, whatever it is. But you also want to plan for generalization and maintenance, which means you have to fade it back. So once students are used to displaying the proper skill time and time again, you don't reward every time after that. The constant rewarding is only for students and for skills that are particularly difficult. One of the best things about behaviorism and using rewards is that students are given immediate help. And what I mean by that is if we think about a constructivist point of view, constructivists tend to believe that students will discover learning on their own. And so I've heard it often talked about in early childhood classrooms where you set up kind of a play-based classroom where you have different centers. And instead of telling students what to do, you let them choose, make choices, and discover things and skills and learning on their own. And I think for a lot of children, this is absolutely fine and it will work well. But what do you do when you come across a student who is not choosing to do any of the activities, who's not choosing to engage with peers, who isn't playing with toys appropriately? And so as the teacher, your options are to either let the child go and assume that he or she will eventually find out what to do or eventually engage in the right ways, or you can immediately intervene and teach the child these skills. And for me, the last thing I'd want to do is let a student waste days, weeks, just waiting on them to discover what the things that they're supposed to discover. I would rather jump in right away and teach them the things that they need to know. You don't want to waste time with these students. So those are some of the things that I think offering praise and rewards can do. On the other side is someone I briefly mentioned him before, but I saw there's books in the library by Alfie Kohn. So Alfie Kohn believes much more in the idea that rewards and praise make a student lose the motivation. So if they're constantly being rewarded for every little thing, then each thing that they do isn't as meaningful. Right? And so one of his big claims is that offering rewards and treating children in this way will turn them into robots. He also believes that students will learn when they are ready. So similar to what I talked about with the early childhood classroom, that you don't force a student to choose a center or to play with things appropriately. They'll discover that on their own. So the big belief is that students shouldn't become dependent upon these tangible rewards. Instead, they should be motivated by learning itself or intrinsic ideals. So I have a couple videos that show you Alfie Kohn and some of the things that he believes. The first one is on punishment. And so we'll watch that and I'll explain it to you after.
Let's say a kid kicks her sister really hard and makes her cry. And we say, you need a timeout. You need to go to your room and think about what you've just done. So let's look in on her sitting in her room. What is going through her head? Is she thinking, now I see that hurting people is wrong. It is literally laughably improbable. Why in the world then would we ever do it? What is going through her head? I hate my sister. I'm awful parents. Not only do I hate my sister, but watch how I'm going to get her when mom isn't looking. Anything else? Nothing potentially helpful is going through her mind. Because punishment doesn't focus kids' attention on what I did, why it wasn't the right thing to do, what else I should have done. It gets them focused basically on just avoiding punishment. Hey, I don't want to catch you doing that again. She thinks, okay, next time you won't catch me.
And to briefly touch on Alfie Kohn's view of punishment, you guys know by now that timeout isn't necessarily a punishment. We don't know if something is acting as a punisher until we see if the behavior decreases. With timeouts, what he's describing, timeout becomes effective if the student or the child is forced to go into the timeout area when the parent then goes and provides attention somewhere else. Right? So what he's discussing is not punishment, and he's not describing it in behavioral terms at all. And, in fact, what he's saying about the child sitting in their room, that's escape, and that's not how timeout's truly used. I also want to point out that Alfie Kohn, in the next video, he'll talk about positive reinforcement. And from the beginning, if you can catch the very first words, he says that there are 2 research studies that basically say that positive reinforcement is bad. And I know you don't have this perspective, but as a researcher, 2 studies, it's minute. There may be 2 studies out there that say positive reinforcement is bad, but I know from my behavioral background that there are thousands, probably tens of thousands of studies that say positive reinforcement actually is a good thing. It's also important to know, too, that Alfie Kohn, who speaks out about these things, he's not a researcher. He basically is an advertiser for everything intrinsic motivation. And so I just think that's important to understand, that just because someone says something, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's any grounds behind what they're saying. So here's Alfie's point of view on positive reinforcement.
The same idea. 2 studies have found that children who are frequently rewarded or praised by their parents are less generous and helpful than their peers on average. And the effect is most pronounced when they're rewarded or praised for being generous. Good sharing. I really like the way you let Patty play with your toy, too. He just became a little less likely to share when no one's around to give them a pat on the head for it.
So I'm not even sure where to start there. I think that on some level it makes sense that we don't want to patronize children. So if students are already sharing, we don't need to do that. When we talk about positive reinforcement, I think it's good for all students, but the way that he described it is not how positive reinforcement is intended to be used. It's intended to be used for new behaviors. So if a student doesn't know how to share and they're doing it, it's important to point out, nice job sharing, and specifically tell them what they did right. This is just a part of learning. All right, so again, the way he talks about it is as if you're saying it over and over again to a kid who's already doing the right thing, and saying it in a patronizing way. Of course, that's not effective for students. And this last part where he says that that kid just became a little less likely to share, completely false. There's nothing behind that as far as research. And obviously, it sounds like I'm really down on Alfie Kohn, but I do appreciate that there's other points of view. And a big part of the problem with people not agreeing with positive reinforcement is that you can't always think of the child who is doing things the right way already. Yes, we don't want to continue to tell them they're doing a good job over and over again if they're already there. We have to focus on the children who aren't doing it, who don't know how to do it. That's when positive reinforcement becomes that much more important. All right, so we know what reinforcement is. The definition is that it increases the likelihood a behavior will occur again in the future. But positive reinforcement occurs when a response or a behavior is followed immediately by the presentation of something, and as a result, the behavior increases in the future. So the key part, which I had told you before, is to think of positive and negative only as math terms, not emotional. So when you hear positive, you just think of the presentation or addition of something. When you hear negative, you picture a minus, something being taken away, right? So try to remember that. Positive means something's being added or presented, which is represented by the plus sign. So an example is the phone rings, that's the antecedent. Your behavior is that you answer the phone. And the positive reinforcement, so what's being added, is that you're able to talk to or hear from a loved one. Therefore, in the future, you're more likely to answer the phone when that person is calling. Another example. If the behavior is the cat running to the food dish, what immediately happened before that? They heard a can being opened. And the consequence is they get to eat. So what's being added? The ability to eat, or the food itself. Therefore, I know for my cat, anytime there's a can being opened, whether it's cat food or not, he comes running because he thinks that food is going to follow. So just to briefly tell you what negative means, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it because it just gets too complicated. So negative is just the opposite. Negative reinforcement also increases the future probability of a behavior occurring because it's reinforcement, right? And we know that reinforcement means an increase. However, it involves the removal, the minus, the subtraction of something. Whereas positive reinforcement, remember, is the delivery of something. So for example, if the antecedent is hear the dinging when you start driving your car, so there's this aversive noise, your behavior is to put on your seatbelt, and the dinging stops. So what's being subtracted here is the annoying noise, or the aversive noise. So in the future, when you hear that, you put your seatbelt on just to escape or to subtract the dinging from the environment. So here's the basic box that everyone associated with ABA refers to. You can see the top says positive and negative, and so down that particular column there are plus signs. So with positive reinforcement and positive punishment, something is being added, whereas with positive reinforcement, the behavior is increasing. So there is positive reinforcement, positive punishment, negative reinforcement, and negative punishment. But all I want you guys to focus on, I want you to see the big picture, but I want you to focus on the idea that we are only going to talk about positive reinforcement. And I think because for our sake, you're going to be teachers, positive reinforcement is what you're going to use the most of. Mainly because if you attach the word negative to anything, it's not well received. So even if you're doing your best and you're telling a parent you're using negative reinforcement, the parents heard you say negative. So don't even get me started. What if you say positive punishment or negative punishment? The word punishment is not something you want to say out loud. All of these things happen in your classroom, and they will. They're just natural parts of behaviorism and the way that we behave and the way that we as teachers arrange our environment. But positive reinforcement is just what schools want to hear and what parents want to hear. Plus, it's just an amazing strategy. Where reinforcement is concerned, we know because of research that in order for a reinforcer to be the most possible effective, it must be delivered 0 to 30 seconds after the behavior occurs. And this is extremely important for everyone, for all children, but especially with students with moderate to severe disabilities. Because often with children with moderate to severe disabilities, we see some difficulties with memory. And so what can happen is, let's say you have a child who sits at a table with his peers and tends to distract his peers during seat work. And so let's say you happen to look over at him and he's doing his seat work, he's doing what he's supposed to do. And so as the teacher, you want to immediately praise him, but you get distracted. Another student walks up and tries to ask you a question. So you answer that question, but as soon as she leaves, you want to make sure you tell that student that he's doing a good job. But what you don't know is, while you were helping the girl that came up to ask a question, he kicked the person beside him and threw the other person, his other neighbor's pencil. And so for you didn't see any of that, but you turn and you say, "Way to go, Peter. That's a great job doing your seat work like you're supposed to." And so if too much time elapses between when the good behavior occurs and when you provide the reinforcement or the praise, then there's a possibility that this other behavior could accidentally get reinforced. Because Peter, he knows he just threw the pencil and kicked his neighbor, and he hears you say, "Good job." That's what he's associating the praise with. So you have to be careful to immediately provide praise for the right behaviors, especially for students who are just starting to learn a new skill. All right, so I'm just going to present to you a few scenarios, and I just want you to think through, is something being presented? Does the behavior increase? Therefore, is it positive reinforcement? When it is time for recess, Cameron runs to be first in line. The class, with Cameron in the lead, walks to the outdoor area. Upon arrival, Cameron is the first to get to the swing set and gets one of the 2 highly coveted swings. Cameron continues to run to line up each day for recess. Right, so if we're looking at the behavior of running to get in line. So what is presented following the behavior of running to line up? For Cameron, she gets to be first in line. So when she runs, she gets to be first in line. That's immediately. And first in line for her means that she gets to get to that highly coveted swing. So the consequence is to be first in line. Does the behavior increase? Yes. Is this positive reinforcement? Yes. So we know it's positive reinforcement because the behavior increases. That tells us it's reinforcement. Is something being added? Is something being presented as a result of this behavior? Yes. The presentation is being first in line and getting to the swing. So this is an example of positive reinforcement. Ms. Smith's 7th graders are not doing the test reviews that she works hours to create, and the students' test scores are not good. She decides to give extra credit points on the test to students who turn the review in completed and with at least 90% correct. Students begin to do the test review sheets each time there is a test. So we're going to take a look at the behavior of completing the study guides. What is being presented following the behavior? The consequence to completing study guides is that they get extra credit points. Does the behavior increase? Yes. Therefore, this is another example of positive reinforcement. The extra credit points are being presented following the desired behavior, and therefore the behavior increases. When Jamie knows the answer to a question, he raises his hand. The teacher calls on Jamie periodically. Jamie continues to raise his hand when he knows the answer. So the behavior of hand raising. What is being presented? In this case, we could say teacher attention, or Jamie's getting called on. Does the behavior increase? Yes, he continues to raise his hand. Is this positive reinforcement? Yes. Behavior increases, which makes it reinforcement. Teacher attention is being added or presented to the student. That makes it positive. Right, Robbie does not receive much attention at home. At school, each time Robbie is bad, his teacher yells at him and sends him to the principal's office immediately. On the way out of class, his peers give him attention by laughing. In the principal's office, Robbie speaks with the secretary. He then goes into the principal's office where the principal speaks with him about his behavior. As a result, Robbie continues to act out in class. So if we're taking a look at acting out or the bad behavior, is something being presented after he displays this behavior? Attention, right? So even though we may think of this as something that's negative, the yelling, the attention is something that is being added to the situation. It's being presented to Robbie for immediately following his bad behavior. So he gets attention from his peers, and then he gets to go hang out with the secretary and talk to the principal. Does the behavior increase? Yes. Is this positive reinforcement? Yes. And I feel like in class I've tried to point out a lot of these scenarios so that you can start thinking of things in a different way. This is another example of something you see in classes a lot. A child acts out, students kind of laugh at him, the students may even be mean to him, but they are providing attention. Right? I don't know about you guys, but we used to have students in high school that if they were disruptive, they would be sent to the hallway. And being in the hallway means you get to sit out there and watch all your friends go by and chit-chat with them when they go by. So often if a student gets kicked out of class, it's not like they get kicked out of class and think it's so horrible that they don't do it again. Right? A lot of times you see the same kids over and over again in the hallway, the same kids over and over again in the principal's office. All right, Sam is a new student at East High School. One morning when Sam brings in his homework completed, the teacher praises Sam out loud and says what a great student he is and how she wishes everyone would be more like Sam. Sam does not bring in his homework for the rest of the week. So we're taking a look at homework completion. What is being presented? Attention and praise. So when Sam performs this behavior of completing and turning in his homework, the consequence is attention and praise from the teacher. Is this positive reinforcement? No, because the behavior does not increase. So again, we often think of attention and praise, we automatically think that's going to be a positive reinforcer. But we can't call it that if the behavior doesn't increase. And again, this is the example that I give when I talk about myself. If a teacher ever did this to me, I would never bring in my homework again because it would be embarrassing to have that attention. So be thinking of things in these ways. So just to check in, true or false? Yelling at a student is one example of punishment. True or false? If you need more time to think on these, go ahead and push pause. It's kind of a trick question. It depends. Just because you see yelling, that doesn't make it punishment. What makes it punishment is if the behavior decreases. So it's only punishment if the behavior decreases. If the behavior increases, yelling can be a form of attention for the student and it can act as a reinforcer. So as the teacher, we think yelling is going to deter a behavior, but if that student happens to be the kind that doesn't get attention at home and just sees yelling or eye contact from the teacher as some sort of attention, it can function as a reinforcer. True or false? Praise is one example of reinforcement. This is the same type of question. It just depends. It's only going to be reinforcement if the behavior increases. But if the behavior decreases, praise can be aversive for the student and it can act as a punisher. Hopefully that's starting to make a little bit of sense. When we talk about reinforcement for the rest of this lecture, we're assuming these are all possible reinforcement, possible reinforcers, but we will only know if the behavior increases. So keep that in mind. So there are basic classifications of reinforcement preferences. So to find out some of the things your students like, you'll typically do a preference assessment. Right? And that can look a lot of different ways. With more mild to moderate students, you can ask them. You can just ask them some of their favorite things. With students with more moderate to intensive disabilities, there are many different ways you can approach this. One of the most common is to find, let's say, 10 different items that may be reinforcing for the student and present them 3 at a time and ask the students to choose. And keep mixing up the grouping until one emerges as the one that he or she chose most of the time. So if you ever want to learn more about preference assessments, we'll probably talk a little bit about that in the moderate to intensive methods course. But you can certainly Google that, and there's a lot of different ways you can do preference assessments. But some of the most common types of reinforcement are edibles, so candy, chips, popcorn, carrots. I always tried to use the healthiest alternatives, but as you probably know, not many of us are reinforced by carrots. Not that exciting. And then I wanted to show you this clip that illustrates candy as a positive reinforcer.
Well, it is the time of year when allergy problems get worse. Might not need to tell you that, but now, instead of taking... Are you finished?
Well, thank you. How thoughtful. Would you like a chocolate?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Oh, sorry, Sheldon. I almost sat in your spot.
Did you? I didn't notice. Have a chocolate.
Thank you.
You're here a lot now.
Oh, am I talking too much? I'm sorry. Zip.
Thank you. Chocolate?
Yes, please. Oh, hey, Kim. Yeah, you know what? Hold on. Let me take this in the hall. You'll never guess who they got to replace you at work.
Okay. I know what you're doing.
Really?
Yes! You're using chocolates as positive reinforcement for what you consider correct behavior.
Very good. Chocolate?
Right, so that's just I think, a visual, hopefully, for the edibles with reinforcement. You can see that chocolate was presented as the consequence for things that Sheldon saw as appropriate behavior. And as a result, she continued to display appropriate behaviors. So in this case, the chocolate did act as a positive reinforcer. There are also sensory reinforcers. I had a student with autism that I worked with, and by far, for him, the strongest reinforcer were these little, they kind of look like eyedroppers or medicine droppers that would vibrate. And he loved putting those against his gums, so that he would do anything to have you vibrate that against his gums. Right? There are also the obvious tangibles, the stickers, the toys, the pencils. Any activities, so extra playtime, having lunch with the teacher, which is, by the way, much more effective at the younger grades. High school kids never wanted to have lunch with me. Any games they like. And then social, the physical contact, the attention, the praise. So this is an example of, it's actually a token economy, but this is an example of tangibles, right? So we would give students stickers, or this would in fact be, well, hopefully it would be for a younger child, but it's not that uncommon to have students in K through 12 that are still trying to be potty trained. One of the things that you always want to do when you're first teaching a student a new skill, you want to make sure that they're able to access the reinforcer, right? So in this example, let's say you would give them a sticker for every single time they went to the bathroom independently and appropriately, right? So that's a good thing. However, if instead you tell them they have so many spots there are here, maybe 20 different boxes here in the train track. If you told them they had to use the restroom appropriately and independently 20 times before they got to the reward, they're probably not going to continue that behavior. Hopefully that makes sense. So if it's a new skill, you have to let them have the reinforcer very often so that they start to understand this behavior results in a consequence that I like. If you make them have to go to the restroom 10, 20 times, it's 10 or 20 times before they see the value in it. Right? So they might go to the bathroom once or twice, but if they're not getting anything immediately from it, they're probably not going to continue that behavior. So you always want to make sure at the very beginning they're able to meet the goal and to get the reinforcer often. You want to make sure that if you're asking the students to do something that's particularly difficult, that you're giving them a reinforcer that's extremely effective. So one of the things you wouldn't want to do is have a student who struggles with reading, tell them once they read 10 chapter books, they can get 5 free minutes of recess. So you can see how those things don't equal out. That's a lot of effort for very little reward. So instead, maybe they get, an ice cream party or a pizza party if they read 10 chapter books. I probably wouldn't even say 10 if it's a struggling reader. Maybe if they read 1, they can have an ice cream party. Right? You want to use varied reinforcement. You don't want to use the same thing over and over again, or it loses its power. You also want to use direct rather than indirect reinforcement when you can. Direct meaning if the student can get the reinforcer him or herself, you want that instead of you handing it to them. So, for example, if they get a sticker on the sticker chart every time they bring in their homework, you don't want to be the one delivering the sticker every time. You want them to grab the sticker and put it on if they can. Always use response prompts when you're teaching a new skill. So when you're setting them, you want to set them up to be successful. So you don't want to, let them go out there to fail. If it's a new skill, let's say you're the first example is verbal instructions, right? So you told the class that if everyone walks quietly and gets in line, that they'll get something, 5 minutes of extra recess. So don't every day just say line up and test them. It's okay at first to give them a reminder. Okay, everybody, before we line up, remember that you need to walk quietly when your table is called. That sets them up for success and to get the reinforcer. Sets them up to be able to get this desired consequence so they start to understand their behavior will result in something favorable. You always want to model when you can. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with Catch a Bubble. It's kind of hard to show you or to talk about it. So Catch a Bubble, they put like a bubble in their mouth, put a bunch of air in their mouth and close their mouth. That keeps them quiet. And then they kind of hug themselves. They're catching a bubble in their mouth and they're catching a bubble with their arms until they're hugging themselves. And that keeps hands to yourself and that keeps quiet mouth. So as a teacher, when you're asking students to line up, catch a bubble yourself. Have, big puffy cheeks with your mouth shut and your arms around you. Physical guidance is okay if needed. When we're talking about a particularly difficult skill, let's say a student's learning how to put on their coat, you may have to physically put their coat on for them a few times. So always know it is okay to use prompts when you're first teaching a skill. You want students to have contact with the reinforcer, with the good consequence, so they understand the value in it. You want to fade these back. You don't always want students to be dependent upon your prompts, but you do a lot of prompts at first and then fade it back slowly. All right, and again with the potty chart, but it just kind of illustrates that you want to reinforce each occurrence of the behavior initially. So you want to provide continuous reinforcement. If it's a new skill, every time they do it, you're telling them they did a good job, pointing out what they did right, and possibly providing a tangible or edible reinforcer along with it. Anytime you can, you want to use contingent attention and descriptive praise. These are two of my favorite strategies, positive reinforcement strategies as a teacher. They're free, they're always with you, and they have a lot of power. So contingent praise is when you give your attention and praise only to when the students are doing what is expected. So if you have a student that's talking out or moving around the classroom, you ignore them and you only give the praise and attention to the students who are doing the right thing. And we'll talk more about that on Thursday. Descriptive praise is telling the students exactly what they did to earn your praise. So things like good job, nice work, that's not going to be good enough. You want to point out exactly what the student did well. So I like how you wrote your name on your paper as soon as you got it. It's better than seeing a child do that and saying nice job. So it tells the student what they did right and how to earn your praise, but everyone else around can hear it too. So they know what to do if they want your attention and praise. You want to gradually increase what's called the response to reinforcement delay. And because you don't want students to do something right and then immediately look at you for approval, you want to fade that out. So once your student's able to do the skill on a regular basis, then it's okay to not say good job right away and give it some time. I don't know if you guys have seen these students, but sometimes when you're working with a student so much, they start to, let's say it's a math problem, and they write the problem and they look at you, and if you don't give them an immediate, that's right, they erase it and keep looking at you and like try again, because they get so dependent upon hearing that it's right before they can move on. So you want to always be gradually increasing that delay. When possible, you want to shift from what's called a contrived reinforcer to a natural reinforcer. So contrived is kind of like fake or reinforcers that aren't normal. So every time you complete a math problem in a normal, natural environment, someone's not handing you a Skittle. That's not normal. But sometimes you have to do those things to get the child to understand the effectiveness of that behavior. So yeah, maybe at first we bribe them a little, but the idea is that eventually they'll see that when you complete these problems, I'll be better at math, I'll get better grades, I'll get my parents' approval, I'll get my teacher's approval. But to get them there, to move from understanding I get a Skittle to then I get good grades and attention from my parents and teacher, you have to pair that Skittle with your praise. So it's not enough just to hand them the sticker or to hand them the Skittle. You have to say, great job, I like how you did that, I like your hard work, I like your persistence. So pair it with something that's more natural. Right? Eventually you want to get to a point where the student understands, if I do the right thing, I get a Skittle, sure. But if I do the right thing a lot, so 10 days in a row, then I take the quiz and I get a good grade. That's something that's more natural, that learning. But for a lot of students, they haven't been successful. And they don't understand, if I'm persistently trying this skill, persistently doing my homework, eventually I'll get a good grade. Some students just don't get there. They don't have the opportunity to earn the reinforcer of good grades. So that's why sometimes we kind of have to bribe them along the way, just so they can get to the point of that long-term learning natural reinforcer. All right, that's today's lecture. On Thursday, the next class, I'll be in touch about when or where class is. We are kind of just told to wait around to see if the air gets fixed or not. So we may have class in Erskine, but we may also have it in Spangler. So you keep an eye out for emails, but I'll also do my best, if I know, to send you that information too, so that you know. All right, so we'll talk about reinforcement strategies, and I do want to finish going over the examples that we did together on Thursday, just because I want to make sure it's really clear for you guys. I think it's a really important concept. All right, so that's the lecture. See you all Thursday.